For months, Amara endured the taunts, the spills, the smirks, until Gavin crushed her in front of the whole office. She snapped, unaware her brother Malik had just taken the CEO's chair upstairs. What happens when a bully picks the wrong fight? Stick around to find out. Amara Davis, 32, sat at her desk in the sprawling open-plan office of Pierce & Company, a mid-sized marketing firm nestled in the heart of a bustling city. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, blending with the rhythmic clack of keyboards and the occasional murmur of phone calls. Her fingers hovered over her laptop, mid-sentence on a project report she'd been perfecting for days, when a familiar sound cut through the noise, a low, mocking snicker from 2 cubicles away. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Gavin Pierce, 40, the senior manager with slicked-back hair, a tailored suit, and a smirk that never faded, leaned back in his chair, tossing a stress ball between his hands like he owned the place. "Hey, Amara," he called out, his voice carrying across the floor. "You gonna finish that report sometime this year? Or is it too complicated for you? Need me to break it down real slow?" Laughter erupted from his clique. 3 other managers, all men who hovered around him like moths to a flame. Ethan, the wiry one with glasses, snorted. "Yeah, maybe stick to the easy stuff, Amara," he chimed in, earning a grin from Gavin. Amara's jaw tightened, her teeth pressing together so hard she could feel the tension ripple up to her temples. But she didn't look up. She never did. She just kept typing, her fingers moving faster as if she could drown out the sound of their voices with the clatter of keys. She'd been at Pierce & Company for 2 years, a project coordinator who prided herself on precision. Her desk was neat, pens lined up, folders stacked, a single photo of her and her brother Malik pinned to the corkboard. She was one of the few black women on the floor, a fact that didn't go unnoticed. From her first week, she'd felt the weight of sidelong glances, the subtle shift in tone when she spoke in meetings. She'd learned early to keep her head down, to let her work speak for her, because standing out only painted a target on her back. And Gavin, he'd made it his mission to keep that target in his sights. It started small, almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying attention. A coffee cup accidentally tipped over onto her desk during a team huddle, the brown liquid seeping into her notes while Gavin shrugged. "Whoops, my bad." A meeting invite forgotten until she showed up late, flustered, to a room full of smirks. A casual, "Hey, Amara, grab us some coffee, will ya?" thrown out in front of clients, his grin daring her to argue. She didn't. She'd wipe the stains, rewrite the notes, fetch the damn coffee, and stay silent. It was easier that way, safer. Calling him out would mean escalation, and she'd seen what happened to the last woman who tried. Fired for poor performance 2 weeks after filing a complaint. But it ate at her. Every night she'd drag herself home to her 1-bedroom apartment on the city's edge, drop her bag by the door, and collapse onto the couch. The silence there was different, heavy, oppressive. She'd stare at the ceiling, replaying the day, the jabs, the laughs, wondering why she stayed. Her phone would buzz sometimes, Malik's name lighting up the screen. At 38, he was her rock, steady, quiet, always checking in. "You okay, Mara?" he'd ask, his deep voice cutting through the static. She'd force a smile he couldn't see. "Yeah, just tired," she'd say, and he'd pause, sensing the lie but not pressing. Malik had his own climb, years grinding through corporate ranks, now a VP at a rival firm. They'd grown up together in a rough neighborhood, 2 kids who'd lost their parents young and promised each other they'd make it. She didn't want to drag him into this mess. He had enough on his plate. That morning had been worse. Gavin had sauntered over, a crumpled memo in his hand, and dropped it onto her desk like it was trash. "Fix this by noon, Princess," he'd said, winking at his crew as they snickered. Her fingers curled into fists under the table, nails digging into her palms. But she smoothed the paper and started typing. The clock ticked louder with every minute. Her stomach growled. She'd skip breakfast again, too rushed to eat. Around her, the office pulsed with life, phones ringing, printers whirring, people chatting over coffee cups. But she felt like a ghost, invisible until Gavin needed someone to kick. She didn't know that upstairs, in the executive suite, the board had just finalized a decision that would change everything. Malik Davis, her brother, had been named the new CEO of Pierce and Company, a move kept quiet until the ink dried. He'd wanted to surprise her, to walk down and tell her himself, but he hadn't counted on what he'd see when he looked out his new office window, a floor buzzing with tension, and his sister at the center of it. Amara typed faster, her eyes burning, refusing to let the tears come. She could handle this. She had to. But the snickers kept coming, a constant drip eroding her resolve. Gavin leaned forward now, tossing the stress ball onto her desk, knocking over her pen cup. "Come on, Amara, don't be so serious," he said, smirking. "Lighten up a little." She froze, her breath catching, and for a split second she imagined grabbing that ball and hurling it back at him. But she didn't. She picked up the pens, one by one, and kept going. Silence was her shield. For now. If Amara's story hits home, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever faced a Gavin at work? Don't miss what's coming next. 3 weeks had passed since that morning with the crumpled memo, and the air in Pierce and Company felt heavier every day. Amara Davis moved through the office like a shadow, her steps quick, her eyes fixed on her desk or the floor, anywhere but the faces around her. The snickers hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd grown sharper, more deliberate, as if Gavin Pierce had sensed her resolve fraying and decided to twist the knife deeper. He'd taken to hovering near her cubicle, dropping comments loud enough for the floor to hear. "Amara, you're slowing us down again," he'd say, or, "Maybe stick to filing. Numbers aren't your thing." His clique, Ethan, Mark, and Trevor, would laugh on cue, their voices a grating chorus she couldn't escape. She'd kept it together, barely. At home, she'd stopped answering Malik's calls as often, letting them go to voicemail. "Hey, Mara, just checking in," he'd say, his tone warm but edged with worry. She'd text back, "Busy, talk later," and he'd reply with a simple, "Okay." But she could feel his concern through the screen. She didn't want him to know how bad it had gotten, how every day felt like wading through quicksand, how she'd started doubting herself, her work, her place. She was good at her job, damn good, but Gavin made her feel small, and the office let him. That Wednesday, the quarterly review loomed like a storm cloud. The conference room was packed, 50 employees squeezed around a long table, the air thick with tension, stale coffee, and the faint scent of cologne. Amara stood at the front, projector remote in hand, clicking through slides she'd spent sleepless nights perfecting. Her voice was steady, outlining timelines and budgets, her dark eyes scanning the room for reactions. She'd worn her best blazer, a deep blue that made her feel sharp, in control. For a moment she thought she could get through it unscathed. Then Gavin opened his mouth. "Hold up, Amara," he said, leaning back in his chair, legs sprawled like he owned the room. "You sure those numbers add up? I mean, no offense, but math's not exactly your strong suit, right?" His smirk stretched wide, and a ripple of chuckles followed. Ethan's nasal snort, Mark's low guffaw. Amara's chest tightened, her fingers gripping the remote until her knuckles ached. "They're right," she said, her voice low but firm, eyes locked on the screen. Gavin laughed louder, cutting her off. "Oh, come on, don't get all sensitive. Maybe stick to coffee runs, leave the big stuff to us." He stood, snatching the remote from her hand with a theatrical flourish, and accidentally bumped her folder off the table. Papers fluttered to the floor like wounded birds. The room went still. Some shifted in their seats, eyes darting away. Others smirked, waiting for the show. Amara knelt to gather the sheets, her face burning, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could feel their stares. 50 pairs of eyes boring into her, judging, weighing. Gavin loomed above, his polished shoe nudging a page further out of reach. "Oops," he said, grinning down at her. "Guess you're used to cleaning up, huh? Comes natural, right?" Something snapped. It wasn't loud, not a scream or a crash, but a quiet, seismic shift inside her. Amara stood, papers clutched to her chest, her breath shallow, but her voice steady. "Back off, Gavin." The words sliced through the silence, sharp and clear. His grin faltered just for a heartbeat before he recovered, stepping closer. "What did you say?" His voice dropped, low and threatening, his 6-foot frame towering over her. "You don't talk to me like that, Princess. Know your place." Her hands trembled, but her eyes didn't waver. She could feel the room holding its breath, waiting for her to shrink back, to apologize, to disappear like always. But she was done disappearing. "I said back off," she repeated louder, stepping forward until they were inches apart. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Oh, shit." And Gavin's face twisted, a mix of shock and rage. He wasn't used to this, not from her. "You're done here," he barked, pointing at the door. "Pack your desk, now." He turned to the room, expecting cheers, but the air had shifted. A murmur spread, confusion, unease, a few nods of silent respect. Amara grabbed her bag, her movements jerky, and stormed out. Past the glass walls, past the stairs, past the whispers that trailed her like smoke. She didn't cry. Not yet. She made it to the elevator, slamming the button with her fist, her breath hitching in her throat. Her phone buzzed, Malik's name flashed, but she silenced it, her vision blurring. She didn't know he'd been watching from the top floor, his new office overlooking the conference room. Upstairs, Malik Davis stood at the window, fists clenched, his sharp suit a stark contrast to the fury in his eyes. He'd taken the CEO role that morning, a surprise appointment after a boardroom coup. At 38, he was a quiet storm. Years of outmaneuvering men like Gavin had honed him into something unbreakable. He'd wanted to tell Amara over lunch, to see her smile, but now he saw her down there, kneeling, then standing, facing off with a man twice her size. His jaw tightened. He didn't move, didn't shout. He picked up his phone and dialed HR, his voice low and lethal. "Get Pierce in my office, immediately." Down in the lobby, Amara sank onto a bench, her bag clutched to her chest. Her hands shook as she replayed it, Gavin's smirk, the scattered papers, her own voice ringing out. She'd fought back. For the first time in months, she'd fought back. And it felt like falling, terrifying, exhilarating, uncertain. She didn't know what came next, but she knew one thing. She wasn't invisible anymore. Amara Davis sat on a bench in the lobby of Pierce & Company, her bag clutched tight against her chest, her breath still uneven from the storm she'd just walked out of. The elevator doors loomed ahead, their steel surface reflecting the fluorescent lights and her own blurred silhouette. Her phone buzzed again, Malik's name flashing, but she let it go to voicemail, her hands too shaky to answer. Upstairs, the conference room fallout lingered in her mind. Gavin's smirk, the scattered papers, her voice cutting through the silence. She'd fought back, but now what? Fired, blacklisted. The weight of it pressed down, her blazer suddenly too tight, her throat dry. She didn't know that above her, in the executive suite, the tide was turning. Malik Davis stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his new CEO office, the city skyline sprawling behind him. At 38, he carried a quiet intensity, sharp suit, sharper gaze, a man who'd climbed from nothing to this. He'd taken the role that morning, a boardroom coup kept under wraps until the papers were signed. He'd planned to surprise Amara, to walk down and tell her over coffee. But what he'd seen from his perch, her kneeling for spilled papers, then standing tall against Gavin, lit a fire in him. His fists clenched at his sides, knuckles whitening. He didn't shout, didn't pace. He picked up his phone and dialed HR, his voice a low rumble. "Get Pierce in my office, now." Minutes later, Gavin strutted through the door, still high on his conference room victory. His tie was loose, his grin wide until he saw Malik behind the desk. "Who the hell are you?" he snapped, tossing his stress ball onto a chair. Malik stood, 6 feet 2 inches of controlled fury, and crossed his arms. "Malik Davis, your new CEO, and Amara's brother." The words landed like a punch. Gavin's smirk vanished, his face paling. "Wait, what?" he stammered, eyes darting to the door like he could escape. Malik didn't flinch. "You've been targeting my sister for months, spilling coffee, trashing her work, humiliating her today. It ends here." Gavin scrambled, his bravado crumbling. "It's just office stuff, kidding around. She's too sensitive." Malik slid a tablet across the desk. Screenshots of complaints Amara never filed, security footage of coffee accidents, emails from co-workers who'd seen it all but stayed quiet. "This isn't kidding," Malik said, his voice steel. "This is harassment, grounds for termination." Gavin's mouth opened, then closed, his hands fidgeting. "You can't. My dad founded this place." Malik leaned forward. "Your dad's not here. I am." Downstairs, Amara's phone buzzed again, a voicemail from Malik. She hesitated, then played it. "Mara, come back up, trust me." His voice was calm, steady, the way it always was when he knew something she didn't. She exhaled, wiping her eyes, and stepped into the elevator. When she reached the top floor, the office door was ajar. Gavin stood inside, flanked by 2 HR reps, his face a mask of sweat and panic. Malik turned to her, his expression softening. "Amara, anything you want to say?" She swallowed, her throat tight, and met Gavin's eyes. He looked smaller now, deflated. "You thought I'd stay quiet forever," she said, her voice steady. "You thought no one would care. You were wrong." Gavin flinched, his gaze dropping to the floor. Malik nodded to HR. "Escort him out. He's done." The reps moved and Gavin sputtered, "This isn't over," as they led him away. But it was. His office was cleared by noon, his nameplate gone, his click silent for once. The next day, whispers filled the halls. "Her brother's the CEO." But Malik didn't stop at firing Gavin. At the all-hands meeting, he stood at the podium, Amara beside him, and faced the room. "This company's changing," he said, his arm around her, "starting with a zero-tolerance policy for harassment. No one gets to feel small here again." The room applauded, some hesitant, some genuine. Amara felt their eyes, not pity now, but something closer to respect. That night, she sat with Malik in his office, the city lights glittering outside. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, a faint smile tugging at her lips. He shrugged, grinning back. Wanted it to be a surprise. Didn't know I'd need to play hero so soon." She laughed, a small, shaky sound that broke the tension in her chest. For the first time in months, she felt light, not fixed, not whole, but lighter. The office wasn't perfect. Some still stared, some whispered. But she walked taller now, her head up, her voice ready. Gavin had picked the wrong target, and she'd made sure he'd never forget it. Amara stood up. "Will you? Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment. Ever faced a bully like Gavin? Let's keep this convo going.